Louganis, the great American diver, won a gold medal on backflips, and I've always thought that providing that they are done with the appropriate degree of panache and style, then they serve a very useful purpose.
Olympic history tells us that Greg Louganis nearly lost that gold medal when one of his backflips sent him crashing into the diving board. But small historical details weren't bothering Prime Minister Keating this week. This was a gold medal week for him, and he was too busy making history of his own. Hello, I'm Maxine McHugh. Welcome to another week of Order in the House. Well, not since the first week of Parliament this year and his first appearance as Prime Minister has Paul Keating so dominated proceedings.
The last comment I made at question time yesterday was that not one issue of substance was raised by the opposition. Not one issue of substance. Now, I've seen an opposition in decline over the years. I've actually been in one. But I'm now watching one, not being able to rise to any of the issues that matter.
The Prime Minister stood over his party to win the high ground of major policy.
Labor, it's always Labor. It's always yesterday a revolution in airline policy, today a revolution in pay television.
And he stood over the opposition to win the low ground of political mudslinging. On the opposition's scare campaign on crime.
You'll never find people in the Labor Party, trafficking in this muck ever.
On the APPM dispute.
We discover that at the time he came out, the leader of the opposition came out publicly supporting APPM, he was in secret discussions with its owners. What a phony. I mean, how duplicitous, having private meetings, geeing the dispute along, trying to get your willful ideological way.
On accusations that Mr Keating had lodged late company returns.
I had a peek at Dr Hewson's record on the same subject. And what I found there, that Dr Hewson's been late in lodging the returns of his companies as listed in the Parliamentary Register for the past 3 years.
And on Dr Hewson himself.
The House will come to order. The member for Kooyong will cease interjecting.
Is the most spiteful and cold-blooded leader that the Liberal Party's ever offered to the Australian people.
At the end of the week, Dr Hewson struck back, but not at the policies Mr Keating had announced. He went for Mr Keating himself.
I'm told every day he has to lie down after the strain and nervousness of the fever in here and have a sleep. He'd be up there, fragile little petal that he is, lying down, having a bit of a snooze.
John Howard was on the warpath as well, looking for the scalp of Industrial Relations Minister Peter Cook over his role in the APPM dispute.
For any minister to talk about bloodshed, that minister ought to be ashamed of himself and he ought to be kicked out of the government.
Only a day later, Mr Howard was kicked out of the House for an outburst of temper. But it was nothing like this effort from Deputy Prime Minister Brian Howe.
There in the annual report. There in the annual report.
Order.
Disgraceful conduct, and you should now name it.
Well, watching Prime Minister Keating at work this week was like watching a one-man political circus. Always a juggler, sometimes a clown, even doing backflips from the high diving tower, and finally the master magician pulling any number of rabbits out of the hat. Ken Randall watched a dazzling performance.
In political terms, May was a terrible month for the government. There was the so-called Marshall Islands affair, Senator Richardson's resignation from the ministry, faction fighting, the environment kit for schools that had to be withdrawn. It must have seemed to the Prime Minister that everything that could go wrong did. At the end of last week, he decided to recapture the political agenda by force of action. Out of the blue last Sunday, he announced long-awaited decisions, apparently personal decisions, on pay television policy and aviation policy. And he turned up the heat on state governments over his plans for technical and further education, the TAFE system. Parliament began its sittings this week on Monday, but the opposition virtually ignored Mr Keating's policy announcements. A bit miffed by that, he organised his own opportunity with a colleague.
My question is to the Prime Minister, and I ask him if he will inform the House of the progress that has been made in implementing the aviation reforms announced in the One Nation document.
Today, in a historic decision, the government has approved the sale of Australian Airlines to Qantas. It's also endorsed the sale of 100% of the combined airline, subject to approval by the processes of the Australian Labor Party. These decisions were taken by Cabinet last night and agreed by caucus this morning. The main factor bearing on the government's decision was the increased value placed on the synergistic benefits which will result from operating the domestic carrier and Qantas together. A sale agreement will be signed tomorrow between Qantas and the government, under which Qantas will pay $400 million for 100% of Australian Airlines. The government, Mr Speaker, is then proposing to offer 100% of Qantas to the market by way of a float or trade sale, and will retain a golden share to provide for national safeguards as required, as indeed other governments have done. And the result will be that we expect to be able to return over $1 billion to the Commonwealth budget after the sales processes have been completed. Now, Mr Speaker, this is another historic change brought by a Labor government. The last time the Liberal Party and the National Party had a go at airlines was in a shabby deal 3 weeks before the 1983 election. After the writs were issued, they signed a two-airline agreement. A two-airline agreement. The very essence of a deal between selling the public interest down the drain, the consumer interest down the drain, to keep a couple of airlines happy by signing up with the government. They're the sort of deals that were done in the days of the former government, the days when the leader of the opposition, the quiet deal maker, the advisor of those days, was in there watching these sort of deals being done. And it's only been this government which has come to the rescue of the Australian consumer, people using aviation, to give them cheaper fares and deregulation by throwing the two-airline agreement out. Now, not only have we now thrown it out, we're now providing a basis upon which Qantas can become a proper international company with a secure domestic base, and we are, by legislation, establishing a commission which will then allocate routes to other domestic airline companies for international routes to develop a second or more carriers. And that second carrier, obviously Ansett will be a bidder for some of those routes, and Melbourne will receive the headquarters, obviously, of a second international carrier.
And having delivered the main message, Mr Keating still had a few points to make about getting things done.
Again, can I say, always we've heard from the opposition what they'll do. There's policy documents everywhere, the brave new world, but in office they never did it. They are the classic non-performers, the people that could never get the mail through. The leader of the opposition told us in that BRW piece he wrote, ministers would put up proposals, but there'd be some anecdotal country party story and they'd just fall away. Nothing ever got through. Nothing ever got through. It always hit the fence because you never had any horsepower and you never had the will to make the policy changes or the courage to push them through. You're run by the bureaucracy always. You're happy to have the white cars, your little office suites, the opening of Parliament Ball, warm gin and tonics at Government House, and that was your role in life. That was your role in life. Well, our role is to change things. Our role is to run the system. And we run the system because ministers decide and ministers make decisions, and the caucus of the government makes decisions. The caucus of the government makes decisions. They decide. This is a government that actually is elected to run the Commonwealth of Australia, and it does. And doesn't just sit behind a group of senior bureaucrats, the mandarins as they were called, who would do their business over a whiskey at the Commonwealth Club on a Friday afternoon and tell you about it on Monday morning. That was the kind of government we used to have in Australia, and that's why Australia slipped back for most of the post-war years, waiting for us to arrive to carry decisions like this.
By Wednesday, the airlines deal was complete. Qantas Chairman Bill Dix signed the agreement with Finance Minister Ralph Willis, and the new Minister for Transport and Communications, Senator Bob Collins, announced an agreement with New Zealand on the first steps towards merging the trans-Tasman aviation market. With paid television, Mr Keating had to do some hard bargaining with his caucus over the role of the existing media organisation and levels of foreign investment. On Wednesday morning, the argument was still running along the old familiar lines.
Isn't the 35% exactly what the networks wanted?
The networks wanted 15% each, which is 45% for 7, 10 and 9, and they weren't interested in the ABC. What we're saying is that if our television networks are going to be in pay, then all four need to be in. And while they have a substantial interest, they don't have the chance to control it.
However, it was all over before Parliament sat on Wednesday, and the final decision was not what Mr Keating originally suggested. But it was his own idea, and everyone on the Labor side seemed happy with it. The opposition view, though, was rather different.
Mr Speaker, my question is to Prime Minister, and I ask the Prime Minister, are you yet in a position to inform the House on pay TV policy, or is this another policy area where the faction leaders of the ALP...
Order.
Where the faction leaders of the ALP matter more than what you do, and have you been decisively rolled? And furthermore...
Order.
And furthermore, given the...
Order.
And given the monumental shambles of the pay TV debate within your government, which has reached clearly crisis proportions this morning, can you inform the House of any discussions that you had this morning or at any other time between yourself and your office or any of your ministers and their officers with Mr Packer or any of his associates or executives?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Oh God, this schoolboy stuff, you get it from over there. Mr Speaker, I'm happy to say that I proposed to the Committee of the Caucus of the Government today, and it accepted, as the Cabinet subsequently accepted and was then presented to caucus, a revolutionary new policy for pay television in Australia. And the basis of that policy is that the government will seek to establish a new operator in the Australian media that is not owned or partly owned by either any of the existing operators, that is, the existing free-to-air television companies, telecommunications carriers or large newspaper groups. In other words, Australia will have a new media entrant which has no shares and owns no part of the old media areas of print television or telecommunications. And that will mean, Mr Speaker, in the development of satellite paid television, the first 4 transponders on the satellite which will be issued upon bidding will find that there will be a pay TV operator in drama, film, sport, etc., which will be virtually a new entrant to the Australian media. As part of the policy, Mr Speaker, as part of the policy on transponders 5 and 6, there will be no equity restrictions. This will be available to the free-to-air television operators, the telecommunications companies, Telecom and Optus, any of the large newspaper groups, and any other interested party, be it a supplier of drama or television or film product.
That left the question of vocational training and the TAFE system. To make his point on that, the Prime Minister went to the National Press Club to open a seminar on ways to give more help to young people in time of recession and structural change.
To accelerate the process, I will convene a series of meetings of peak business organisations, employers and the ACTU to advance the development and implementation of the pilot projects which will test the new approach. For the reforms to entry-level training to be successful, they must be backed up by a greatly expanded and improved vocational and education and training system. I'm convinced that the best way to achieve a truly national system of vocational education and training is for the Commonwealth Government to assume a key role. In One Nation, I propose that the Commonwealth enter into a partnership with the states, with the Commonwealth assuming full responsibility for the funding of the system, while the states retain responsibility for its administration, management and the planning at a local level. To date, we've been unable to reach agreement on this proposal. One option, which has many attractions, is for the Commonwealth to go further and assume full responsibility, not only for funding, but also for the administration of TAFE.
Meanwhile, back in the Parliament, opposition members had been laying the ground for a booby trap, so they thought. After midnight on Monday, Senator Michael Bohm made a speech about a company called Pluron Proprietary Limited, in which Mr Keating and his family have a large investment. Senator Bohm was worried that the news media were about to knock off his story. He followed up with a question next day, and Senator Bronwyn Bishop did her bit with a motion to debate the answer. Then the action moved to the House of Representatives.
Mr Speaker, my question is addressed to the Prime Minister, and it flows from the remarks he just uttered prior to the suspension of the member for Betamax about fops, frauds, cheats,
Order.
Mississippi riverboat gamblers, all of which he has epitomised at various times.
Order. The member for Kooyong will get to his question.
Is it a fact that the Prime Minister recently invested $500,000 in a piggery, piggery company once owned by former Labor Minister John Brown? Is it further a fact that the company has breached the ASC's reporting requirements, just as he failed to file his tax return? How does he account for this continuing decline in standards, or is this just the same old Keating thuggery of do as I say but not as I do?
The member for Kooyong has the gall to ask me a question in the House referring to supposedly the assets which I have and have invested in a business which produces pig meat. Now, Mr Speaker, let me just say that investment is about equal to the price of one 365 GTB Ferrari, like Dr Hewson's has, or one Lamborghini Miura like he has, or the 3 Rolls-Royces, 3 Mercedes-Benz and the Rolls-Royce, let alone the $3 million property in Bellevue Hill, or the $1.5 million property in Bowral. And perhaps the Leader of the Opposition, perhaps the member for Kooyong can tell the last Leader of the Opposition to tell us exactly about how he left here in 1983 as an officer serving a treasurer and came back in 1987 with $5 million worth of assets, and how he's worked all sides of the streets throughout the portals of Sydney business to advance himself politically and commercially. Now, Mr Speaker, it is true that my return of information on the company was late, and I regret that, and it shouldn't have been.
Order.
But, Mr Speaker, and it shouldn't have been. It was 3 months late. It was not late in 1990. This is not a tax return. This is an information return. Now, Mr Speaker, you see, it's
Order.
when the opposition engage in this juvenile muckraking, it's very interesting to see. I had a peek at Dr Hewson's record on the same subject, and what I found there, that Dr Hewson's been late in lodging the returns of his companies as listed in the Parliamentary Register for the past 3 years. For the past 3 years.
Order.
How about that?
Order. The House will come to order.
His returns for his companies, Brent Mar Holdings and Tabazo Proprietary Limited, were both late this year, due on the 31st of the 1st, 1992, but not lodged until the 3rd of the 2nd, 1992. Last year, Mr Speaker,
The House will come to order.
Last year, Mr Speaker,
Order. The House will come to order. Members on my left will...
Last year, the returns for both companies was lodged more than 6 weeks late, due on the 31st of 1st, 91, but not lodged till the 9th of the 3rd, 91. In 1989, this is a long history, in 1989, the return of Brent Mar was even later, not lodged until the 10th of the 4th, 1990, over 3 months late. And for the same year, the return of Tabazo was later still, not lodged until the 19th of April 1990. Now, this is the man who's got Senator Bohm doing his dirty work in the Senate.
Well, that wasn't a bad riposte, but Mr Keating wasn't satisfied to stop there.
I thought I'd have a look at the interests of the Shadow Treasurer, Mr Reith. He has a company listed as Branley nominees, but guess what? Late again. His 1991 report was lodged late on the 31st of the 1st, 92, not lodged until the 8th of the 4th, 1992. Not lodged until the 8th of the 4th, 1992. Even worse, his company's report for 1990 was late by 10 months, due on the 31st of the 1st, 91, but not lodged until the 4th of the 11th, 1991. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition came into this Parliament offering a better style of politics, offering to deal with the issues of substance. He has senators doing his dirty work in the Senate, and then he has the member for Kooyong up doing his question, which is, of course, an organised question approved by him on these issues, while I've been spending my night organising a new regime for paid television in this country. And spending yesterday in a historic reorganisation of the airline system of this country. The Leader of the Opposition thinks the clever way to play politics is he should go and have a senator represent him in the Senate, and then on radio making these points, and then selling the dump to the member for Kooyong, who you could sell the town hall clock to, obviously. You sell the town hall clock to, the Sydney Harbour Bridge and a block of flats in Tasmania to go with it, who then gets up and asks the question about this, and what do we find? That Dr. Hewson, whose company secretary is his wife, failed to lodge these returns, as did his deputy.
In both houses, the opposition kept prodding the Marshall Islands affair and Mr. Greg Simmons. The construction company Multiplex has been mentioned several times in this context. The opposition thought it might be a chance to embarrass the Prime Minister.
Order. Is he aware that Mr. Roberts pledged a donation of $200,000 towards Labor's campaign expenses at the infamous gold tax lunch attended by Mr. Hawke in Perth during the 1987 election campaign?
Order. The Honourable the Prime Minister.
About the Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker, I've always said they have more front than Mark Foy's. Here they are. This member, we had, what's Chinese name again? Pearce, a member for Pearce, the most petite and well-dressed, quiet, unassuming little bag man that we've ever seen. Dancing around between the offices of Perth.
Order, the House will come to order.
Slipping quietly.
Order.
Slipping quietly up and down the quiet elevators of the terrace, getting the cheques for the Liberal Party, and getting caught.
Nevertheless, the opposition and the Democrats in the Senate thought it was time to press for action. They voted together to pass this motion.
In moving this motion, I wish to draw attention to two separate aspects of this proposed judicial inquiry. One relates to the many questions which have been raised in recent weeks regarding the possible intercession by minister or ministers or staff of ministers or members of the bureaucracy on behalf of the business dealings of Mr. Simmons. And the second, which is really a quite separate issue, although it has arisen out of this, is the appropriateness of the ministerial conduct which has surrounded these issues.
A resolution like that is not binding on the government, but the opposition wanted a response.
Will the government establish a judicial inquiry into the Marshall Islands affair, as called for by a majority of the Senate and by key parties involved such as Multiplex and Mr. Simmons' business partner, Mr. Bonney? If not, why not? What do you and your government have to hide?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the last comment I made at question time yesterday was that not one issue of substance was raised by the opposition. Not one issue of substance. Now, I've seen an opposition in decline over the years. I've actually been in one.
Order.
But I'm now watching one, not being able to rise to any of the issues that matter. Watch your stock in trade, running around in inquiries, hiding behind senators in the Senate, trying to turn the Senate into a kangaroo court, and when you're not doing that, frightening old ladies with pamphlets with guns in them. I mean, that's about your speed.
Order.
That's about your speed. You're not capable of anything else. Mr. Speaker, I made clear yesterday Senator Richardson's resigned his position. by, as I said, not improperly but unguardedly dealing with this person Simmons, and I've got no intention at all of agreeing to the proposition of the Leader of the Opposition or any of his stoolies in the Senate.
Paul Keating in full cry and at full speed. Dr. Hewson remarked yesterday that it had been a terrific week for the opposition. It just shows it's all in the eye of the beholder.
Not a good week for the opposition. In the face of big political decisions and encouraging economic news, it continued its pursuit of small political scandals and with very mixed results. At best, it won a Senate request for a judicial inquiry into the Marshall Islands affair, battered contemptuously away by the Prime Minister, and at worst, the company returns ambush that went dreadfully wrong. By the end of the week, the Leader of the Opposition, Dr. Hewson, had to do something, and in the light of the major policies announced by the government during the week, his speech in the House on Thursday had all of Parliament talking.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are witnessing the final days of the Keating government. Yeah. And it has an eerie similarity to the final days of the Whitlam government. You do think back to those final days in 1975 and the massive turmoil on the other side of the House as they sought to divert attention from some pretty deep-seated stenches associated with that government, and you see precisely the same situation happening today. There is a smell about this government. The smell starts in the areas like the Marshall Islands affair. It goes right through the policy changes that we have observed in the course of the last few days. It goes right through the entire government. Now, I said when this Prime Minister became Prime Minister that he would be remembered as a wrecker. He would be remembered as the person that destroyed the Australian economy and the lives of average Australians, and he would be remembered as the person that destroyed the ALP. And we have seen in the last few days early evidence of just how true that assessment was. As this man, under the pressure of events of the last few weeks, went onto television last weekend, made a whole string of new policy announcements, changed his mind a multitude of times in the course of the last few days, and has the hide to stand up and say he's bringing about a revolution in policy. A revolution in policy. To me, that means you're going round and round and round in circles. And that's exactly what he's been doing in the course of the last few days. But let's just think back to where this newfound strategy of the Prime Minister's emerged when his friendly chat with Laurie Oakes last Sunday. Let's think about where it started. The events of the last few weeks. You just have to watch him in the Parliament. You see him today? I mean, he's so twitchy. He hasn't got any fingernails left. They're down the back of his throat. He's not sure what's coming next. Day after day, for weeks on end, there's been question after question about the involvement of his senior ministers and his closest mates and his numbers men in the Marshall Islands affair and all its ramifications now that spread from Western Australia, north to Hong Kong, east to the Marshall Islands and south to Victoria. And he hangs, and the last concern is, of course, the mentions of Danpork and other associations from his family companies in the course of the last few days. And he sits there, he twitches, he's a bundle of nerves, he's fallen behind in the polls, and the polls that came out this week are the same sort of polls that existed when they got rid of Bob Hawke. Remember? Go back, they're the same polls that existed then. His personal popularity is going down, his unpopularity is rocketing up, and he was in a state of panic by the time he got to the end of last parliamentary week, and he'd had such a horrific week in this place. And if you go back through some of the issues he's backed in the course of the last few months since he's been leader, they've all gone bad on him. One Nation. Remember One Nation? The document he brought down. We polled One Nation. You know what people think One Nation's about? I think it's about changing the flag and getting rid of the Queen. They did such a successful job at bringing down a policy package for Australia that people out there think it's got something to do with changing the flag and getting rid of the Queen and nothing to do with dealing with the fundamental problems of this country. And so with a clear sense of forward-looking direction and planning that you'd expect from a Prime Minister, he panicked on Saturday morning or Friday night, probably Friday night, got hold of Laurie Oakes and said, mate, I've got to come on your program. I'm going to make some major announcements. Give me a couple of soft lobs, the first couple of questions, and I'll give you a story that'll run for a week. And that's what happened. Right, he goes on television, he announces a completely new approach to three areas of policy, to aviation policy, to TAFE colleges, in relation to TAFE colleges, and of course in relation to pay TV. And those policies were announced, and they ran most of Sunday afternoon on the media and into Monday morning, and that's about as long as they lasted. That's about as long as they lasted, because as every day went on, we got another policy. Right, if you think back, we had 3 pay TV policies. Right, we started out, interestingly, with the Packer option of 45% shareholding in the next licensee. Just coincidence, of course. But that was the position he announced on television on